Hi, I'm Ken Heyman. As Managing Director of the Advisor Institute at AllianceBernstein, I meet with financial advisors every day. One thing I hear expressed over and over is their frustration with how much they are juggling. The advisors I talk to are constantly trying to balance competing priorities, from managing client relationships to prospecting for new business, and of course, the tasks of leading their team. This problem of juggling is why we created the AllianceBernstein Digital Coach. This is a proprietary tool that draws on the wisdom of behavioral economics and unique perspectives from the Advisor Institute's practice management experts. In less than 10 minutes with the Digital Coach, you will be able to identify and prioritize the top needs of your practice. And armed with those insights, you will be well on your way to tackling the challenge of limited resources while positioning your business to seize opportunities for growth. Let the Digital Coach guide your journey to success. Visit abfunds.com/go/digital coach. That's abfunds.com/go/digital coach.
Welcome to Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we dive deep into the habits, mindsets, and strategies that set top financial advisors apart. I'm Scott Tatum, and today I'll be talking with Ken to finish his thoughts on the big mistakes advisors make when working with ultra-high net worth clients. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's podcast is brought to you by Total Family. Total Family is your practice management resource for working with uniquely successful families who want to do legacy work that leads to more cohesive and resilient family structures across generations. Visit totalfamily.io for more information. That's totalfamily.io. So let's get to it. Leave the outside world behind for 25 minutes, jump inside the circle of trust, and look deep inside human behavior to explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide. Ken, in our last episode, you covered mistakes 1 through 3. Today, we're going to look at mistakes 4, 5, and 6. Mistake 4, this time comes from the client's perspective. Advisors think that super wealthy clients see the world in the same perspective as other clients, and that's not the way they look at the world, is it, Ken?
It's not. And the challenge here, Scott, is that this is a normal function of human behavior. And so it's dangerous for us to speak about mistakes when it's perfectly normal and almost inevitable that a human being, a financial advisor who is a human being, will bring their previous experiences and their own experiences of life to the work they have with advisors. How do you know what another person's thinking? How do you know what another person's feeling? Well, you have to borrow either on your own experiences of life or the experiences of other interactions you've had. Most advisors have not worked with dozens of ultra-high net worth clients. Most advisors have not journeyed through the process of a liquidity event with an ultra-high net worth client who ran a business, decided to sell a business, went through the process of preparing to sell a business, sold the business successfully, and then adapted to what it's like to be on the other side of selling a business, which is to become a completely different person in the world. That process that I just described, we call that at the Advisor Institute the emotional journey of the ultra-high net worth client. That process affects the human being and changes them from the patterns, the beliefs, the emotional experiences that most other people have. And the significant difference for the ultra-high net worth client, there's a couple actually. The significant difference in terms of how the experience affects them is that the experience is abrupt. So if we look at the sense of change, so if you're a mass affluent client and you come out in the world and you get a good job and you start saving and you start accumulating a little more money than you need to spend, you hire an advisor and you build your wealth and you budget your money and you grow your assets, your biggest concern is how rapidly are we growing the money? And your biggest question is, well, am I going to be okay in retirement? That's really the vast majority of people who are investing. And by the way, that's not even the vast majority of people living in the United States. The vast majority of people living in the United States, more than half of the people living in the United States, don't accumulate wealth. But a substantial group of the mass affluent do. And so their experience of working with the advisors pretty isolated and centralized around this idea of growing their wealth and getting to a secure retirement. They're not concerned about whether the grandkids are going to have money or not in 3 generations. They're concerned about whether they're going to make it to the end of their life secure. Now, the high net worth client has a different experience in that regard as they accumulate more wealth through a variety of mechanisms, and they cease being concerned about whether they're going to be okay in retirement at some point, and they start being concerned about managing this money. And for them, there is a concern about wealth transfer, but you have somebody with $7 or $8 million and 3 kids, that wealth transfer is not a very complicated issue. And what you hope is that money will sustain those kids and then maybe help with the next generation. But there's no sense of some kind of phenomenal change of the journey of their life. Their life journey is a gradual adaptation to the accumulation of wealth. This is not true for an ultra high net worth client. They go through a process of abrupt transformation. And what advisors miss is that it's a transformation that is both a gain and a loss. And it's really hard for advisors to understand the counterintuitive nature of the fact that when you sell a business for $150 million, you're not just gaining $150 million, you're losing an identity. And you're being thrust into a new experience of life where, because that money is so substantial, and now the question about whether you're going to be okay is completely off the table. And in fact, even the question of the complexity of your life is somewhat overwhelmed by the fact you have all this money and that you'll probably figure out how to be okay and have a comfortable life with $150 million. It's hard to screw that up. What you have to think about now is this money is going to continue well beyond my life. It's going to redefine my children. It could support grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But interestingly enough, in our culture, then you ask these people who have this huge amount of wealth, do you know the names of all 4 of your grandparents? If you ask the typical 100 millionaire, do you know the full name of all 4 of your grandparents? 53% of them don't know the full name of all 4 of their grandparents in the United States. And if you ask them, do you have a sense how your grandparents' lives translated into the experience you've had, how their story connects to yours? And they'll say no. If you ask that of the ultra high net worth client about, do you want your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to know your story and how your story created the experience they're living in with this abundance of wealth? To a person, they'll say, oh yeah, I want that. And so you begin to see that this transition, this abrupt transition of wealth, thrusts them into a whole new stage of issues that they have to contend with. What's the new meaning and purpose of my life? Will my grandchildren remember me? Will my great-grandchildren even know who I was? And I was talking to a financial advisor who works very extensively in this space the other day, and he was telling me the story of his client who sold a business and moved to a very attractive part of the southeastern United States, where a lot of other really wealthy people tend to go after they sell their business. And he said, I moved into this community. I'd known about it for years, I'd visited for years, and now I'm a resident there, bought a really nice house. And everybody where I live used to be somebody. He said, now I most recently became a used to be somebody when I sold my business. And he said, now I go to the coffee shop and I'm just another guy in this beautiful town buying coffee. He said, back when I ran my business, I walked into the room, I was not just somebody, I was the biggest somebody. And everybody around me would get a little nervous. People, we're going to the staff meeting or the board meeting or the sales meeting. Everybody around me get real nervous. That doesn't happen anymore. And I realized how much I miss that. That's just a little taste of what it's like to go through this transformational process. And it can take them years to cope with it. And more importantly, what they have to do is they have to build a new sense of what is the meaning and purpose of my life now. Now, we would suggest that the vast majority of advisors who have the opportunity to talk to a client like this don't know that that's the big deal that they're dealing with. They're going to map their own experience of previous advisors or previous clients to their experience of this client. And they're going to assume that the issues have to do with either growing the money or making sure that the asset management and wealth management model is complete. And by the way, those are important things to do. But for these people, that's not where their heart is. That's not where their concern is. That's not where their worry is. For these people, it's 6 months after the sale of the business. They played a whole bunch of golf. Or as one client says of another advisor I was working with, you know what? I've spent a lot of time fishing over the last 6 months, something I've always really loved to do. But you know what I discovered the other day? Every fish more or less looks like the last fish I caught. And this isn't creating any meaning, purpose, juice, energy, passion in my life. Remember, these are people that were passionate enough and bright enough and risk-taking enough and delaying of gratification enough. They could build a business they sold for 50 or 75 or $100 million. And they're now out in this space and they don't know who or what they are. Their whole experience of life is really different from other people. And it behooves the advisor who wants to work in this space not to make the error that they know what these people's experience is, but to approach them with humility and with some sense of understanding what the process is and listen to what their unique challenges are. Very few other people will do that. In fact, in many cases, these people have families that have kind of turned away. We call this toxic envy. It's very common for their circle of friends and their family members to turn away and be resentful of them because of this enormous windfall. They start living lives of isolation. It's powerful when an advisor can step in there and say, look, I haven't gone through your experience, but I've helped a bunch of other people who have, and I have a sense of what this is like. Let's talk about it a little bit before we worry about all these other details.
That fourth mistake is clearly that type of client does not view the world the same way as your other clients do. That brings us to the fifth mistake, which is advisors have an instinct that they want to put these clients on the same type of set it and forget it protocol as they do other clients. And that really doesn't work, does it?
It doesn't. And let's talk about that because this is one of those elephant in the room issues in financial services. You know, back in the day when I first started, you and I both first started back in the 80s and the 90s, financial advisors weren't financial advisors. They were called stockbrokers and they ran transactional businesses. And the way you became successful in the transactional business is you had a circle of clients that you would deploy capital, redeploy capital, redeploy capital. And there was the sense of you were growing something for this individual, but you were taking a piece of the action on each of those deployments. So every advisor came in the morning and said, how many calls do I have to make today? What's my number that I'm trying to make today? And they organized themselves that way. That's ancient history. There's still a few advisors who do that. But for the most part, advisors have shifted to fee-based. Well, a fee-based business isn't as robust a business in terms of how much you can generate with a client over the course of a year, but it's a very stable business. And it's a business that allows you to look at the bigger picture of a client's life. Well, for a lot of advisors, their interest is in accumulating as many clients as possible with a fee-based business model that allows them to harvest from those clients in a consistent way. But a lot of the times what you see with these advisors is you get the client, the plan is set up, the portfolio's created, they have a sense of where things are headed, they schedule that annual review, they schedule whatever their servicing model is, 4 or 6 or 8 calls a year. And now this becomes an incredibly manageable process. And in some cases, I will talk to advisors. There's a lot of advisors in the second half of their career, they buy a vacation house and they're gone, a third of the time because pretty much this thing is running on its own. It's set it and forget it. Now, I know there are advisors that'll take umbrage to that they're doing a lot of work, and they are doing a lot of work. But the idea there is they have a very predictable sense of here's the effort I put in, here's the return I get. I'll get a new client. I'll put a lot of effort into this process in the upfront and get them set up and get them going. And then we'll get them into this program and then we'll manage them and I'll get another client. And so there's this sense of this thing can become a pretty efficient issue. Well, when we start talking to advisors about getting involved in legacy work and working with the ultra high net worth and starting to work with the client, the originator client who needs to do values clarification and needs to really get clear about meaning, purpose, what the story has been so far, what is my story, what drove my story, what do I want my story to look like going forward? These are not simple conversations. They're not easy conversations. They're certainly something the advisor can do and facilitate well. And that's something that the client absolutely wants to have the conversation with once you open the opportunity up. It's where their spirit has taken them because of their experience of the wealth. And these are rich, amazing explorations where the client learns as much about themselves just by having the conversation as they would in any other place. And then you start to think about bringing the couple together to have values clarification, creating a shared vision, and then bringing the next generation in to start having family meetings. The advisor can be part of facilitating that. We start talking to the advisor about this role and this ongoing conversation about the family's legacy and creating a vision to which the wealth gets attached so that the advisor can continue to support the family across generations. As the older generation passes, they're still connected to the wealth. And the advisor will look at me and say, that sounds like a lot. What kind of return on all that effort can I expect? And I think that's a valid question for if the advisor thinks that somehow now I've got this $150 million client that I'm going to plug into my asset management model, talk to once a year about the asset management model, and they're going to see me as relevant in their life. I think the advisor's making a big mistake, one of the biggest mistakes. That client is smart enough to know what kind of fee they're paying, what they're kind of getting, and they're smart enough to be looking at themselves and saying, am I getting what I need from this relationship in this new stage of my life? Now, I will suggest to the advisor, if you want to grapple with this idea of legacy and grapple with this idea of really working effectively at the point of need of the ultra high net worth client, then the task is to create a very high touch model and to expect to have lots of these kinds of high quality conversations that are moving toward a destination. We're moving toward values clarification and getting the story told and connecting the story to the family and getting the family meetings going. This is the work the advisor can be very involved with. What will be the return on investment? Well, I can tell you three things. But if the advisor's thinking short term, so that like the return on investment has to be in the next 3 months or next 6 months, and I'm going to have all these conversations, seems like a lot of work to do, and the advisor doesn't realize the long-term issue here, then this can be really hard to invest in. It can be really hard to see as relevant. And by the way, a lot of things that advisors get to in the second half of their career can be hard to invest in. Going back and going out and doing new business acquisition can be hard to invest in. I have $200 million under management. I have a robust business model and a robust revenue model. What do I have to do to continue growing that? And is it worth it to me for that extra $3 million this year to go to all the effort to do that? That's the question. Well, I'm going to suggest that if you start doing this kind of legacy work, this kind of meaningful engagement with the ultra high net worth client, there's three benefits. First, you become hyper relevant to your best clients. So if you go hard at this and you build a business where your top 10 clients are these ultra high net worth types of clients, and your business is truly robust, your relevancy to them matters. Credibility isn't the issue. Are you having relevant conversation with them? And do they see you connecting to them at their ongoing, dynamically changing and evolving point of need? And are you relevant and connected to the larger family and the needs of the larger family? So relevancy is the issue. But hyper relevancy means that your value is assured and insured, and they will never leave you in that regard. And so you've locked down the first major issue of growth, which is don't lose what you've built. Remember, these are highly pursued clients, and staying highly relevant to them is the most important thing you can do. The second thing, though, is that you become highly referable. These people are all connected to others like themselves. Wealth tends to find wealth. And if you're doing things that no one else is doing and is at a high level of relevancy, they will talk about you to others, and they will make referrals of you to others because they have something to refer them to you for. They're not going to refer you to your portfolio management unless you're doing something that's anomalously superior, and I would suggest that's really hard to accomplish. But meeting people at their point of need with skills that most advisors don't have, absolutely doable all day long. So you become highly referable. And most importantly, on the long haul, once you move them to the point where they're connecting the wealth, the family's connecting the wealth to a legacy vision that is going to sustain over the course of multiple generations, and is built into a structure, that legacy vision can be something that you remain connected to. So the wealth gets connected to the legacy, and the advisor gets connected to the legacy, and you move forward in time in that regard. Now you begin to see that if you're thinking 10, 15, 20 years forward in your own business or the business that you have a succession planning for, this is probably the most important thing you can do to send a gift forward to yourself in time. Now, the question the advisor has to ask is, am I willing to afford the effort that requires? Because it's different than the typical advisor whose business kind of grows a little bit at a time and is pretty highly manageable, and they can go to their vacation house half of the year and not worry too much about their business. This is a high touch model that is going to require more of the advisor than most.
So that fifth mistake is very clear. The engagement model for the ultra high net worth has to look very different than it does for other clients. And that brings us to mistake 6, the last mistake that hits advisors close to home. Mistake 6 is that advisors think that ultra high net worth clients are primarily concerned about managing money, when what they really want is to create a cohesive and resilient family structure.
Well, I think that really sums up this dynamic tension we've been talking about here, is that once you move into this ultra high net worth space, the client who's achieved this level of wealth, who's now being defined by this level of wealth, has an experience that was described almost a century ago by Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, worked in the first half of the 20th century, and most people are familiar with his name because of a concept called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And while this is pretty basic psychology, and our whole study of behavioral economics has moved well past his simplistic model, it's still valuable. And by the way, it's still one of the more quoted models in academic psychology. What he basically said is human behavior is organized around unmet needs. And so if you think about your body as being an organism that's in a dynamic relationship with the environment, you think about really basic needs like you need air or you need water. So I use this as an illustration. If you're swimming and you begin to have a cramp or something that causes you to be unable to swim effectively, and you start falling under the water and your air is cut off, your primary need is now being threatened. The most immediate thing that humans have to have is respiration. The only thing you'll think about is getting to the air. And anybody who's ever studied like life-saving knows that humans will panic in that circumstance. And you have to be very careful that that human can be dangerous, because that panic, they're so defined by getting to the air that they will actually hurt the person trying to rescue them to get to the air. That summarizes Maslow's hierarchy. But what he said was, as you resolve basic needs, if you have plenty of air and you have plenty of water to drink and you have plenty of food and you have some sort of protection from the elements, then you start being concerned, well, how can I make sure that protection remains? How can I create security and a sense of confidence about the future? Then I start thinking about relationships and belonging and love and intimate connection. And then I start thinking about status and presence and where am I in the world in terms of my status. And if you think about folks who suffer from the poverty syndrome, where they never achieve the sense of security in the world, they're living kind of day to day, barely surviving, which is like 20 or 30% of the population. They have incredible difficulties with relationships and they don't have any sense of status. But as people succeed and they go up this hierarchy, Maslow described this as fewer people are there, but what they're feeling as their needs is very different from lower levels. So if you get up to a high level of need, you have a high level of accomplishment and status, people actually cross over into this concept of self-actualization. Self-actualization, Maslow described as something that very rarely people achieve, but is really then the drive to perfect their life. And a lot of times this has to do with they seek a different level of meaning of their life. Sometimes they want to become a teacher or a philosopher. Sometimes it's about giving back in large ways. I just saw Michael Dell gifted a huge gift of resources to educational needs for kids. This is an act of self-actualization to perfect their life. Sometimes it's about aesthetics. That's why people will donate money to museums and will create art collections. It's this drive to perfect their life. what we see is that when individuals cross over into this ultra high net worth place, this is happening with much greater frequency than it did when Maslow was creating his theory. And in fact, Maslow didn't have access to people like this. He was an academic. Now, we spend our days working with advisors and with people like this. And so it's a much more real and present process. Well, when you want to self-actualize, you start thinking about the story of your life, and you start thinking about your life connected not just to the end of your life, what am I doing this week, this month, et cetera, but out into the next generation, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations downhill. That has been the driving source of all the great philanthropists in history have been individuals who start to be aware that their life has substance beyond just the immediate survival and immediate pleasure. So when I have advisors that I've worked with who are working with clients who have all this wealth, and the advisor says, well, you can buy anything you want. And the client's like, that's not going to solve my issue. That's not what I want to do. And they may not even say that to the advisor. I know sometimes the advisor gives them advice and they're like, yeah, let me think about it, because they know that's not going to do it for them. And this is why the advisor needs to understand that it's growing the money at an accelerated rate is no longer their concern. They may look at that asset management and say, yeah, I want it to grow. There's a vision I want it to fulfill. I want it to be stewarded going forward. It has to be properly managed. They may be concerned about tax consequences and they may want to minimize tax consequences, but that's not what's on the heaviness of their heart. That's not where their emotions are. They're not looking like the mass affluent or the high net worth client who has some money, but not as much, it's not like redefining their life. It's just enough that they're going to be okay. Their heart's concern is how it's managed. Are we growing fast enough? Or is this big enough? They're going to judge the advisor on that. The person with $150 million who knows they can't spend it all, that's not what they're looking to the advisor for. They're looking for the advisor to navigate an experience in life that is baffling to them, and they need support, they need guidance, they need to explore their values, they need to understand the story so far and then start to write the story as they want it to be going forward. This isn't stuff that we talk about a lot in our culture. Advisors who want to work in this space, they need to understand that drive for this long-term legacy, for this high-touch consulting process, for these rich conversations, and really need to understand that these are very, very unique individuals who need to do a very, very unique piece of work so that that vision of the future, not just the immediate, but the long-term future, is something that they actually can take some control over and author going forward. The advisor who figures that out, who gets that clear, who equips themselves to do that, that advisor is irreplaceable and highly referable. And I don't think there's any greater goal for an advisor than those two things.
Well, Ken, that's our time for today. As our listeners return to the busy world of running their practices, let me remind them that we would love their ideas for future podcast topics. You can visit my LinkedIn site, Scott Tatum at AllianceBernstein, and leave your idea, or you can go to Ken's LinkedIn site and do the same. That's a wrap for this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we have explored the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide.